welcome to the How to Learn Anything course from Plato University, where you're going to learn the science-based tools of pro learners to accelerate your learning, remember more, and master any hard skills. These are the secret techniques they didn't tell you in school. If you're passionate about changing your life with learning, join us at plato.university to get exclusive content with every lesson. I'm your learning guide, Brandon Stover, and let's get started. Okay, the third technique that we're going to learn in active learning is called chunking. And the principle of chunking states that learning is easier when material is organized into 3 or 4 organized units, each of which can contain 3 or 4 units. So essentially, any material that you're starting to learn, if you can start consolidating the material that you're learning into little chunks of information, and 3 or 4 units of that information, you're going to more easily remember it. And we'll explain why here in just a second. But broadly, this works so effectively because we store information in our minds as organized units, not individual isolated bits of information. And as we can start consolidating this information into units, and those units, we start to consolidate into larger concepts. Now, let me give you an example of chunking to illustrate this. I'm going to give a series of letters, and if you're watching the video, you're going to be able to see this easier, but I'll describe it on the audio as well. So to get a sense of what a chunk is, listen to the following sequence of letters for a few seconds and trying to memorize what they are in order. So XX, CBS, CIA, IBM, NBC, XX. Now, if you're watching the video, try and look away and actively recall. And if you're listening to the audio, try and actively recall the sequence of letters that I just described. How many of the letters were you actually able to memorize? Now, what I want you to do is try it again, but this time I'm going to give you a hint. Look for or listen to the 3-letter acronyms of famous organizations as I start to say them again. XX, CBS, CIA, IBM, NBC, XX. Now try and recall the sequence of letters that I just gave you. Now, most people can memorize the entire string when they start seeing those chunks of letters that are memorable to them. For example, in this sequence, there were the organizations of CBS, the CIA, IBM, and then NBC. And then you just slap on the XX on both ends. By creating those little sequence of letters, those acronyms, I help you to organize the individual letters into units, which are actually called chunks. So now you're able to memorize the 16-letter sequence because you've created chunks of that. Now this works not just for our little example here, but any type of information that you can start creating chunks with. Now, why do chunks work so effectively? Well, let's return back to the science within our mind of that balance between working memory and long-term memory. If you recall, your working memory can only hold up to about 4 pieces of information in the mind at once. If you're trying to hold too many things in your working memory, it becomes overwhelming, and information and thoughts start to fall out as you're working with it. So during learning, we try and move that information from our working memory to our long-term memory. And that's because the set of links that you can create in your long-term memory is virtually limitless. Now compare that to our working memory where we can only hold 4 concepts in our mind at once. So by moving these things to our long-term memory, these sets of links serve as pre-worked extensions of your working memory. They boost the power of your working memory. And by going through the process of chunking, like in the example of creating those acronyms, you're allowing your working memory to create those links that can be placed into long-term memory and easily accessed and used to solve problems and understand concepts in the future. Now, why is this an effective strategy for you to use? Because it essentially allows you to store information that you're learning faster, put it into long-term memory, and then as you start working on bigger and more complex problems, you don't have to hold all this information in your working memory. You're able to recall those sets of links and those different chunks to the forefront, start working with it on the current problem that you have, and then let it fall back to the background. Now, how do we apply this at Plato University? Well, whenever possible, we try and put our material into chunk sections. We break down each skill course into chunks that can be completed in a day, and then they start to build upon each other to create entire concepts. So for example, in our How to Start a Podcast course, we broke that down over 60 days, giving you each one of the steps that you need in order to gain the skill of starting, marketing, and then monetizing a podcast. But within that, we even broke that down, as you just heard, into starting the podcast, marketing the podcast, and then monetizing the podcast. And within those sections, we even broke it down further into chunks like recording the podcast, editing the podcast, and launching the podcast. Again, all of this to help you store the steps that you need to complete these skills in your long-term memory. Now let's talk about the steps you need to use to start applying this to anything that you're learning. The first step is to look at the totality of a subject or skill that you need to learn. What are all the pieces of information that you need to be able to learn to actually use this skill or fully understand this subject? Then start taking pieces of that subject or that concept and begin breaking it down into manageable chunks, grouping things together that you can work with in your short-term memory and start creating concept chunks to store in your long-term memory. A good place to start is with the fundamentals of the subject. What are the fundamentals of the skill that will always be necessary to correctly execute that skill? How can you break the skill down into the least divisible unit and then practice it to perfection? For example, if you're an artist, some of the things that you might include in your practice is shape and form, value, edges, and color. Really disciplined and expert craftsmen always return to these fundamentals because they heavily influence the quality of any finished work. To practice drawing a line from one point to another over and over until you get it perfect seems boring, but it's your ability to perform that tiny chunk that will greatly influence everything else you do. So spend time mastering each individual chunk and then also spend time integrating multiple chunks together until you get the concept just right as a whole. So good practice is each day try and get one chunk down perfectly. And as you start mastering all of these chunks, put them together in larger chunks and move to faster and more complex variations of the skill or the problem that you're working on over time so that you start to gain mastery of this concept. To practice this technique, I want you to take a skill or concept that you're learning and begin to break it down into chunks that you could practice or begin studying so that it's more easily embedded into your mind. Thank you for taking the How to Learn Anything course. To get everything you need to become a pro learner, including advanced resources, personal coaching, and a community of passionate learners just like you, then visit plato.university/courses/learning and join us for free. Again, that's plato.university/courses/learning. This course was produced by Plato University, where students turn passions into purpose and learn skills to change the world. Learn more at plato.university.